9 words. That's all she left him. 9 words, and a little girl upstairs who didn't even know yet that her world had just changed forever.
Daddy, did Mommy leave because of me?
In that single moment, Daniel realized rebuilding wasn't optional anymore, Ben. It was the only choice left. He thought it was the worst night of his life. He had no idea that minutes later, a stranger's car was about to change everything he thought he knew. The words that came next would unravel a secret 35 years in the making. I am your father, Daniel.
The rain had not stopped for 3 days, and neither had Daniel Cole's hands from shaking. He stood on the cracked concrete porch of the house he could no longer afford, holding a single sheet of paper that read exactly 9 words. I can't do this anymore. Take care of her. No signature, no goodbye, no explanation for the 7-year-old girl asleep upstairs, who would wake up in the morning, asking where her mother had gone. If you have ever stood in a doorway and watched your entire life collapse into a single piece of paper, you already know why this story matters. And if you have never felt that kind of silence, then stay with me, because by the end of this video, you will understand why a stranger's kindness can rebuild a life that seemed unrepairable. Before we go further, if stories about real resilience, real fatherhood, and real second chances mean something to you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what happened to Daniel in the next 60 minutes changed not only his life, but the lives of everyone who ever doubted him. Daniel was 34 years old, a master carpenter who built custom furniture out of a garage workshop that smelled of sawdust and linseed oil. He had married Vanessa 8 years earlier, back when they were both broke and hopeful, back when a shared apartment with a leaking faucet felt like a palace because they were in it, together. They had a daughter, Emma, a bright-eyed girl with her father's stubborn chin and her mother's quick laugh, though lately, that laugh had grown rare in the house. The marriage had been fraying for a year, quietly, the way old rope frays before it finally snaps. Vanessa had grown tired of counting pennies, and tired of a husband who worked with his hands instead of climbing a corporate ladder, tired of a life that never seemed to catch up to the one she saw on other people's screens. Daniel had noticed the distance, but told himself it was a phase, the kind of rough patch every marriage survives if you just keep showing up. He was wrong. On a Tuesday morning in early October, Vanessa packed 2 suitcases while Emma was at school, and Daniel was finishing a cabinet order across town, and by the time he returned home, she was gone, along with half the furniture, most of the savings, and any explanation beyond that single scrap of paper on the kitchen counter. He read the note 4 times before it made sense, and even then, it didn't really make sense. Not the way things are supposed to make sense. He called her phone 11 times. It rang, and then, on the 12th call, it went straight to a voicemail box that was already full. He drove to her sister's apartment, then to the gym she used to go to, then to a coffee shop where she sometimes met friends, and found nothing but confused shrugs and pitying looks. By the time he came home, it was nearly 9 at night, and Emma was sitting on the porch steps in the because she had let herself in with her spare key, found the house empty, and been too frightened to go inside alone. She was soaked through, her backpack sagging on her shoulders, and when she saw her father's headlights swing into the driveway, she ran to him and asked the question that would haunt him for weeks afterward. Daddy, did Mommy leave because of me? He knelt down in the rain and held her, and told her, with a certainty he did not yet feel himself, that none of this was her fault, that sometimes grown-ups make choices that have nothing to do with the people they leave behind, that he was not going anywhere, not now, not ever. He carried her inside, dried her off, made her a grilled cheese sandwich because it was the only thing he could think to cook with hands that would not stop trembling, and sat with her until she fell asleep on the couch, still gripping the sleeve of his shirt. Then he walked back out onto the porch, sat down on the top step in the cold October rain, and allowed himself, for the first time that day, to fall apart. He did not cry loudly. He simply sat there, elbows on his knees, staring at the water running off the gutter, feeling The specific and total loneliness of a man who has just realized that the life he built with his own two hands has been dismantled by someone else's decision, and that he has no idea how he is going to hold the pieces together for a little girl who is counting on him to know. It was in that exact moment, headlights cutting through the rain, that a long black limousine turned onto the quiet residential street and rolled to a stop directly in front of his house. Daniel barely looked up. He assumed it was lost, some wedding car or corporate driver who had taken a wrong turn into a neighborhood of modest homes and chain-link fences, but the limousine did not pull away. Instead, its rear door opened, and an older man stepped out beneath a large black umbrella held by a driver who had come around to shield him from the rain. The man was perhaps 70, silver-haired, dressed in a charcoal wool coat that probably cost more than Daniel's truck, and he walked up the driveway with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never once in his life worried about being unwelcome anywhere. Daniel stood, wary, wiping his face with the back of his hand, unsure whether to be alarmed or simply too exhausted to care. "Daniel Cole?" the man asked, his voice steady, almost gentle. "Who's asking?" Daniel said, stepping slightly in front of the door, an instinct as old as fatherhood itself. The man studied him for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, softened, the way a person's face changes when they are looking not at a stranger, but at a memory. "My name is Richard Sterling," he said. "You won't know that name, but I imagine you've heard of Sterling Dynamics." Daniel had. Everyone had. It was one of the largest logistics and technology conglomerates in the country, a name printed on the side of half the delivery trucks that rumbled past his workshop every single day. "I'm not here about business," Richard continued. "I'm here because 35 years ago, I made a mistake I have spent the rest of my life trying to find the courage to fix. Your mother's name was Diane Cole. Does that sound familiar to you?" Daniel felt the ground tilt slightly beneath him. His mother had died when he was 19, of a heart condition the doctors said had likely gone but untreated for years because she could never afford the specialist visits. She had raised him alone, working double shifts at a diner and later as a hospital administrator, and she had never once, in 19 years, spoken his father's name. When Daniel had asked, as a child, where his father was, she would simply say, he wasn't ready to be one, and change the subject with a firmness that discouraged further questions. Daniel had grown up believing his father was either dead or simply a man who had never cared enough to look for him. "I am your father, Daniel," Richard said quietly, the umbrella trembling slightly in his grip, though whether from the wind or from nerves, it was impossible to tell. "I found out about you a year after you were born. I was 22, terrified, building a company from nothing, and I told myself that walking away was a temporary decision, that I would come back once I had something to offer. Weeks became years. Years became decades. I told myself 100 different lies to justify never knocking on that door, and every single one of those lies was cowardice wearing a suit. I have spent 35 years becoming a man other people admire, and I have failed, every single day, to become the one man who actually mattered, which was your father. I found out you were living here, alone tonight, from a private investigator I hired 8 months ago, when my doctor told me my heart is failing, and I do not have the luxury of more excuses. I am not here to buy my way into your life, Daniel. I am here because I am dying, and I could not let that happen without at least standing in front of you and telling you the truth." Daniel did not invite him in that night. He stood on the porch in the rain, arms crossed, and told Richard Sterling, in a voice that shook with 35 years of a child's unanswered question, that he did not know what to do with any of this, that today of all days he had nothing left in him to process a father rising from the dead while his wife had just walked out the door, that Emma was asleep inside, and he needed to be there when she woke up, not standing in the rain, sorting out feelings that had been buried since before he could remember. Richard did not argue. He simply nodded, reached into his coat, and handed Daniel a card with a phone number written in careful, old-fashioned handwriting. "I am not asking you to forgive me tonight," he said. "I am asking you to let me try to earn it, if you'll allow it. And whatever is happening in your marriage, whatever just happened tonight, you do not have to face it alone anymore. Not unless you choose to." Then he returned to the limousine and disappeared into the rain, leaving Daniel standing on the porch holding a business card and the wreckage of everything he thought he understood about his own life. For 3 days, Daniel did not call. He was too consumed with the practical avalanche that follows a spouse's disappearance, canceling joint accounts before they could be drained further, explaining to Emma's school counselor why she had suddenly gone quiet in class, figuring out how to keep the workshop running when half his savings had vanished with Vanessa. He filed for emergency custody, a formality really, since Vanessa could not be located and had made no attempt to contact either of them. A month later, papers arrived from a lawyer in another state. Vanessa had filed for divorce remotely, waiving any claim to custody, asking for nothing but a clean and quiet exit. Daniel signed the papers at his kitchen table at midnight, Emma asleep upstairs, and felt something strange settle over him. Not relief exactly, but the beginning of clarity. Whatever kind of family he was going to build now, it would be built without pretending that half-hearted love was enough. It would be built on people who actually stayed. It was Emma, in the end, who convinced him to call Richard back. She had found the business card on the kitchen counter, turned it over in her small hands, and asked her father who Richard Sterling was, in the innocently direct way that only children can ask the questions adults spend years avoiding. Daniel told her the truth, or as much of it as a 7-year-old could hold, that this man might be her grandfather, a man he had never known, who had come back to try to make things right. Emma considered this with the seriousness of a much older person, and said, "Everybody deserves a chance to say sorry, Daddy. You always tell me that." Daniel sat with that sentence for a long time before he picked up the phone. The first meeting was awkward and careful, held at a quiet diner rather than anywhere that might feel like Richard was trying to impress him. Richard arrived without an entourage, without the limousine, just a man in a plain jacket, ordering black coffee and asking Daniel questions about his childhood that he clearly already knew the painful answers to, listening, as if hearing them for the first time, could somehow retroactively change them. He asked about Diane, and when Daniel described her death, the years of exhaustion, the specialist appointments she skipped because the copay was more than a week's groceries, Richard's composure cracked for the only time in the entire conversation. He did not ask for forgiveness. He simply said, "I could have saved her that, and I chose a boardroom instead of a doorbell. That is a debt I can never repay. But I am asking you to let me try to be useful to you and to Emma now, in whatever way you'll allow, with no strings and no expectations." What followed over the next several months was not a fairy tale rescue, though it might have looked like one from the outside. Richard did not hand Daniel a check and disappear. Instead, he showed up, consistently, in the unglamorous ways that actually rebuild trust. He came to Emma's school play and sat in the third row, clapping too loudly. He learned, slowly and clumsily, how to be a grandfather, asking Daniel awkward questions about what 7-year-olds liked, getting it wrong sometimes, trying again. When Daniel's workshop lost its lease because the building was being sold, Richard did not simply buy him a new one. Instead, he connected Daniel with a small business consultant from his company who helped him draft a real business plan, secure a proper loan under his own name, and negotiate a lease he could actually afford, insisting that Daniel build his success on his own hands, the way he always had, with support rather than replacement. "I don't want to buy back the years I missed," Richard told him one evening, watching Daniel sand down a table in the new workshop. "I want to earn the years that are left." There were setbacks. Daniel struggled with anger he had not expected, moments where grief for the childhood he never had collided violently with gratitude for the man standing in front of him now, and he would lash out, then apologize, then withdraw, for weeks at a time, needing space to sort through feelings that did not fit into any tidy narrative. Richard never pushed. He kept showing up at the diner every other Sunday, whether Daniel came or not, quietly proving through consistency what words alone could never prove. Slowly, month by month, the visits stopped feeling like obligations and started feeling like something closer to family. Emma, who had lost a mother and gained a grandfather in the same season of her young life, adapted with the resilience children often have in greater supply than adults, calling him Grandpa Richard long before Daniel was ready to use that word himself. And somehow, that small act of a child's trust did more to soften Daniel's guard than any apology could. A year after that rainy October night, Richard's health took a serious turn. A second heart episode landed him in the hospital, and for 3 days, doctors were uncertain whether he would recover. Daniel sat in that hospital room more hours than he worked that week, holding a hand that had once, 35 years earlier, chosen a boardroom over a nursery, now trembling and fragile in his own. He realized, sitting there in the sterile hospital light, that somewhere in the last year, the man he once refused to let into his house had become someone he was terrified to lose. When Richard finally opened his eyes on the 4th day, the first thing he saw was his son asleep in the chair beside his bed, and the second thing he saw, when Daniel woke moments later, was something he had waited 35 years to see. Forgiveness, not spoken aloud, but plainly written across his son's exhausted face. Richard recovered, though the doctors were clear that his heart would never be fully strong again, and something about that fragility seemed to reorder his priorities even further. He stepped back from daily operations at Sterling Dynamics, appointing a trusted executive to run the company, and spent his remaining energy doing the things he said mattered most. Sunday dinners at Daniel's house, teaching Emma how to fish badly at a lake house he barely used anymore, sitting quietly in the workshop while Daniel worked, simply being present in a way he had denied himself and his son for over 3 decades. Daniel, for his part, found that rebuilding his life did not require erasing the pain of the divorce or the decades of his father's absence. It required learning to hold both the wound and the healing at the same time, understanding that forgiveness was not a single decision made on a rainy porch, but a practice repeated, imperfectly, over months and years. But the road to that peace was not a straight line, and roughly 18 months after that rainy October night, it curved sharply, in a direction none of them expected. A letter arrived at Daniel's workshop, forwarded through his lawyer, from Vanessa. She had seen, somehow, a local news segment about Sterling Dynamics funding a scholarship program for trade schools, a small philanthropic initiative Richard had quietly started in Daniel's name, and the segment had briefly mentioned that the program's inspiration was the founder's son, a carpenter in the same city she had once called home. It did not take long for Vanessa to connect the dots, and it took even less time for her to decide that a father worth billions changed the calculation of a daughter she had walked away from without a second glance. Her lawyer's letter did not mention love, or regret, or even Emma by name in any meaningful way. It requested a formal reassessment of custody arrangements and, buried in careful legal language, a renegotiation of financial support that made its true motivation obvious to anyone who read between the lines. Daniel read the letter, standing in the exact spot in his workshop where he had first told Richard, months earlier, that he did not know if he could ever trust him completely. The old fear rose in him instantly, sharp and familiar. The fear that everything good in his life was somehow conditional, that people only stayed when there was something to gain, that even his own daughter might become a bargaining chip in someone else's calculation of self-interest. He drove to Richard's house that evening, letter in hand, angrier than he had been in over a year, and for the first time since their reconciliation began, he said the thing he had never quite allowed himself to say out loud, that he was terrified this whole situation, all of it, the wealth, the sudden family, the second chances, was going to be the very thing that took Emma away from the stability he had. fought so hard to give her. Richard listened without defending himself, without offering a single reassurance until Daniel had finished, and then he said something that stayed with Daniel for the rest of his life. Money did not make Vanessa leave, and money will not be what protects Emma either. You will. The court does not care about my bank account, Daniel. It cares about who has been present, who has been consistent, who has shown up for that little girl every single day for the last 2 years. That is you. That has only ever been you. Let me help you find the best family lawyer in the state. Not because money should decide this, but because you deserve someone in your corner who can prove, plainly and clearly, what has already been true the entire time. The months that followed were among the hardest of Daniel's life, harder in some ways than the original abandonment, because now there was something concrete to lose in a courtroom, rather than simply grieve in private. He gathered records of Emma's school attendance, her pediatrician visits, her teacher's notes, 2 years of birthday parties, and packed lunches and late-night fevers he had sat through alone, building, without realizing it, an accidental archive of everything real love actually looks like when nobody is watching. Vanessa's side, by contrast, struggled to produce anything beyond the note she had left on the kitchen counter, and a legal argument built almost entirely around proximity to wealth, rather than any demonstrated relationship with her daughter. Emma, when the court-appointed evaluator spoke with her privately, described her life with a simplicity that cut through every legal argument in the room. She talked about her father teaching her to sand wood without splinters, about Sunday dinners with her grandfather, about a school play her father had never once missed, and when asked, gently, whether she remembered her mother, she said only that she remembered being cold on the porch steps and that her daddy had come to get her. The judge's ruling, when it finally came, took less than 10 minutes to deliver and left no ambiguity. Full custody remained with Daniel. Vanessa's request was denied in its entirety, and the court noted, in language rarely so direct, that the petition appeared to be motivated by circumstances that had changed for the father's family, rather than any genuine re-engagement with the child's welfare. Vanessa did not appeal. She disappeared again, this time without even the courtesy of a note, and Daniel, walking out of the courthouse with Emma's small hand in his, felt something inside him finally settle into place. Not triumph exactly, but a quiet, hard-won certainty that the family he had built, imperfect and unconventional as it was, could not be shaken loose by anyone who had not earned the right to be part of it. Richard was waiting outside on the courthouse steps, and when Emma ran to him and he lifted her, laughing, into the air, despite his doctor's warnings about strain on his heart, Daniel understood that whatever mistakes his father had made 35 years earlier, the man standing in front of him now had more than earned the title Emma had given him from the very beginning. 2 years after that first knock at his door, Daniel stood in his newly expanded workshop, now employing 3 other craftsmen and supplying custom furniture to clients across the state, watching Emma, 9 years old now, sand down the edge of a small stool with the same stubborn concentration her father had at her age. Richard sat in the corner in an old armchair, reading a newspaper, occasionally offering unsolicited and mostly unhelpful woodworking advice that Daniel accepted anyway because it made his father happy to feel useful. Vanessa remained gone, a closed chapter that no longer defined the shape of their family, and Daniel had come to understand something he tried, later, to explain to Emma when she was old enough to ask about it. Sometimes the people who are supposed to stay leave, and sometimes the people who left find their way back, and neither of those things is a reflection of your worth. What matters is who chooses, again and again, in the small, unremarkable moments of an ordinary Tuesday, to actually show up. The scholarship program that had first drawn Vanessa's attention continued to grow long after the custody hearing faded into memory, eventually funding trade school tuition for over 200 young carpenters, electricians, and welders who might never have afforded the training otherwise. Daniel insisted on personally interviewing every recipient, a habit Richard found unnecessary, given how large the program had become. But Daniel wanted each of those young people to know that the money behind their opportunity was not an abstract, corporate gesture, but came from someone who understood exactly what it felt like to build a life with nothing but calloused hands and stubborn hope. He often told them the same thing he had once told Emma on that rainy porch step, that where you start does not determine where you end up, but who stays beside you along the way makes all the difference. Several of those students later joined his own growing workshop, and Daniel took quiet pride in watching them become the kind of craftsmen who cared as much about the joints and grain of a piece as he did, carrying forward something that had nearly been lost the night his own life fell apart. Emma grew into a thoughtful, sharp-witted teenager who kept a small wooden box on her dresser, the very first thing her father had ever taught her to build, its corners slightly uneven, its finish a little rough, and she refused every offer to replace it with something more polished. She would tell people, when they asked about it, that the box was not supposed to be perfect. It was supposed to be honest, made during a year when neither she nor her father knew exactly how the story was going to end. Richard lived to see her graduate high school, his heart weaker by then, but his presence, as always, unmistakably there in the third row, clapping too loudly, exactly as he had at her school play all those years before. He passed away peacefully 2 years later, at home, with Daniel and Emma beside him, having spent the final chapter of his life doing the one thing he had failed to do at the beginning of Daniel's, simply showing up, again and again, until showing up was no longer an act of penance, but simply who he had become. If Daniel's story taught him anything, it was that a single sheet of paper on a kitchen counter does not get to decide the whole story, and that the family you end up with is not always the one you started with, but it can still be the one that saves you. He thought about that rainy October night often, not with bitterness anymore, but with a strange kind of gratitude, because it was the very worst night of his life that had, minutes later, brought a stranger's limousine to his curb and, eventually, a father back into his life, and a grandfather into his daughter's. Some nights, sitting on that same porch step, now dry and quiet, he would watch the street where the limousine had once appeared through the rain, and think that the hardest moments in life rarely announce what they are actually building toward. You simply have to survive the falling apart long enough to find out. Years later, when people asked Daniel how he managed to rebuild everything after the divorce, he never led with the story of the billionaire father, or the company, or the money, that eventually, quietly, helped stabilize his business in ways he was slow to admit he needed. He led instead with Emma, sitting on the porch steps in the rain, asking if her mother had left because of her, and the promise he made in that moment to never let her doubt her own worth again. Everything else, the reconciliation with his father, the growth of his workshop, the slow rebuilding of trust in a man he had every reason to resent, all of it existed in service of that single promise. He had learned that real strength was not the absence of collapse, but the decision, made again each morning, to get up anyway, and build something steady for the people who depended on you. And if a billionaire's limousine happened to pull up in the middle of your worst night, well, that was not the point of the story. The point was that Daniel Cole, a carpenter with sawdust in his hair and a broken heart in his chest, chose, every single day afterward, to keep building. If this story moved you even a little, remember that the people who show up quietly, consistently, without asking for credit, are the ones who actually change a life. And if you believe that too, make sure to like this video and subscribe, because there are so many more stories like Daniel's still waiting to be told.